Today, we're going to be taking a look at how to make this rustic serving tray. So if you're ready, let's get started. Welcome to the Lit Channel, where we're always learning interesting things. The first thing we need to do is cut the wood to size. So we used our tape measure to get the length correct, and then we used a speed square to get a straight line across the wood. Next, we had to clamp the wood down to the stand to make sure that it doesn't slip out when we're cutting the wood with the circular saw. We used a circular saw by cutting along the line with the speed square, and now we just adjust the wood so we can start our second cut. What I decided to do was use the same length of wood from the first cut to get a line across and then clamp the wood down. And then again, we're going to use the speed square so we can get a straight cut along the wood using the line that we marked. For the third piece of wood, we followed the same steps. We just used the original length wood, use the pencil to strike a line across the lumber, and then we hold the speed square on the edge and use that as a guide to cut square along the wood. And as you can see, we have 3 of the same length pieces of wood that we can use for the tray. In order to get the rustic weather look that we wanted on the tray, we used a metal brush wheel and a drill. We used our respirator so we wouldn't inhale sawdust, and then we used that metal brush wheel on the wood as follows. By using this metal brush wheel and the drill, it allows us to remove some of the meat between the grain on the wood. Depending on the outcome that you're looking for, you can use this technique to remove as much or as little of meat between the grain on the wood as you'd like. There's a great video by Matthew Peach Woodworking here on YouTube where he goes into great detail on how to make a rustic weathered look when you're dealing with wood. As you can see, I did not use too much of the metal brush wheel on the wood because I didn't want to remove too much of the meat, but this was what the resulting outcome looked like on the wood. Now that we finished the first portion, using the drill and the metal wheel to make the wood look weathered, I decided to use my X-Tool D1 Pro to laser etch the words "Home Sweet Home" on the wood. This design was requested for the tray, so I decided to use my laser to make sure that all the lines came out clean on all the words. For this specific project, a darker stain was requested. So what I did was put the stain in the bowl, and then I decided to use a sponge brush as opposed to a normal paintbrush when applying the stain. One thing that I like about rustic weathered looking wood projects is that you don't have to be as careful about applying the stain evenly, because as you'll see later in the video, once the stain dries, you end up sanding it down to give it that rustic look. So as you can see, I'm just generously applying the stain and getting it to the rough color that I'd like, because later on I'm going to be sanding it down so we can get that rustic look. And this is just a quick sample of the different levels of sanding you can do when removing the stain for the rustic look. Throughout this project, I decided to experiment with a couple of new techniques. What you're seeing here is I decided to use a light brown color and decided to paint inside the letters of the words "Home Sweet Home." Another thing you'll notice is that I was not worried about staying inside the lines of the letters. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned earlier, in order to get the rustic look that we're trying to achieve, we have to sand down the top layer of the wood. When we sand down the top layer of the wood, all of the paint that's outside of those letters, "Home Sweet Home," will actually be sanded off because the words are engraved by that laser, and those letters are a little bit deeper than the actual top layer of the wood. The next step in this project was creating a quick base. So what I did was I measured and cut a fence picket and decided to sand it down so I could get a smooth surface on it. So as you see here, I'm just running the orbital sander over all the different sides and giving a quick sand before moving on to the next step. For safety purposes, I always like to keep my table saw unplugged anytime I'm working near the blade. As you can see, I'm adjusting the blade height, and now I'm measuring the wood just to make sure I can get it cut relatively accurately. Now, one thing to remember is this is going to be the base of the tray, so having super accurate measurements is not as important because this will be on the bottom where no one can really see it. So I went ahead and plugged in the table saw, and then I have my push sticks to make sure that we're safe and we're not getting our hands and fingers or anywhere near on our body close to the blade when the saw is on. And now, as you can see, we just run the fence picket through the table saw and cut the wood as we need it. And now what you're seeing is we're taking the metal brush wheel and the drill, and we're giving that same technique that we used to give the rustic look, and we're going to do that on all sides. And what this is doing is removing some of that meat between the grains of wood. And now that we've gotten all of the metal brush wheel technique done, we went ahead and grabbed that sponge brush and grabbed the stain, and we're just going to go ahead and hit the stain on these pieces of wood before we create the base. And one thing you'll notice is when we're applying the stain, we're only applying stain to 3 of the 4 sides. And the reason for that is because one of the sides is actually going to be attached to the bottom of the tray, so we don't need to worry about wasting stain on that part. So once the stain dries, we go ahead and grab the orbital sander and just run it over the stained wood again. And what you'll see is a very quick sanding over the stain will reveal the grain of the wood and give it that rustic look that we were looking for. And this is a comparison of the 2 styles. So now that we've got the sanding done, what we're going to do is we're going to grab our 18 gauge brad nailer, and we're going to use this to help us attach the base to the bottom of the tray. So we go ahead and flip the wood over and get it all lined up how we want. And then we're just going to grab our wood glue, and then we're going to hit a small bead of glue across the bottom, and then put the base where we'd like to have it attached, and then we just hit it with a few brad nails. Now I probably went a little overkill with the brad nails on this. Because it's not a load-bearing system, we don't need to have that much support with the nails, but those brad nails do help keep everything in place and help the wood glue dry. And so as you can see, I did the same thing on the other side. Hit the bead of glue, use the brad nails, and hold everything in place. Alright, so now the base is attached. We went ahead and looked at the top of the tray again. And as you can see, the paint is still overlapping the letters. So what we did was we grabbed the orbital sander, and now we're just going to run it over the wood and start getting that rustic look that we were looking for. And as you'll see, because of using that sander, it did take off all that extra overlapping paint that we talked about earlier on. So we run the orbital sander over there until we get to a level or color that we like from the stain, and then here's how it looks. So after trying out the light brown color for the words, I decided I didn't like it. So what I decided to do was make the letters black. So you can see that I'm spray painting the wood and the letters black to get uniformity across and get that dark black color in the letters. So once I spray painted it black and let everything dry, I decided to grab the orbital sander to go ahead and sand it down the same way I did before. And what you'll see is that once we hit the sander on top of the wood, it's going to take off a lot of that black paint that was left over on the top of the tray. The nice thing about this is it's going to make a little bit darker of a final color on the product, but what you'll see here shortly in the video is I did go ahead and use that brush metal wheel technique with the drill again to take out some more of the meat. Now experimenting with different techniques is great, but I decided I like this way a little bit better. I'm kind of glad that it happened because we can learn from our mistakes. So here you'll see what it looks like with the black paint in the letters and on the wood. And now here what you're seeing is I did take that metal brush wheel with the drill, and I'm taking out more meat between the grain. And so it's doing the same exact thing as we did before, except now when we add the stain, it's going to have that darker black tone underneath the stain we choose. So now what we're doing is the same exact thing we did earlier, but this time I decided to use an actual paintbrush. So I'm just applying the stain to the wood, and you'll notice I don't have to use a large amount of stain because, again, after the stain dries, we're going to go ahead and sand it all down and get it to the tone that we like on the final product. The nice thing about using a paintbrush is that I'm able to get in between all the different grains, and also I'm able to get stain in between the areas where that metal brush wheel took out some of the extra meat on the wood. So the dark brown stain that I used is filling in the wood nicely, but now this is what it looked like once it was dry and I took that orbital sander on it again. And you'll notice I'm not having to use a lot of time when I'm sanding everything down, but it gave it that rustic look with the black letters. So what you're seeing here is a graphic representation of what the final project will look like. The top image is a bird's eye view from above, and the bottom graphic is a cross section of the tray. I labeled all the sides so you'll be able to pause the video if you need to. The walls on side A and B are going to be the same length as the boards that say Home Sweet Home, and the boards on side C and D need to be long enough to account for the 10.5 inch width of the 3 boards and the extra 3/4 inch on each side from sides A and B. So now that we know that, all we have to do is some basic arithmetic in order to get the correct length for sides C and D. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the 10.5 inches for the width of the 3 boards and add the 3/4 of an inch for both sides. So that's going to tell us we need a total length of 12 inches for sides C and D. Alright, so now we're back with the tray. So there's 2 ways we can measure. We can use that tape measure, or we can just hold the wood up to the board since we know it's going to be the same length, and use our pencil to get a little mark, and then use the speed square to strike that line across the whole piece of wood. Now what we're doing is we just grab the clamps, we go and clamp that wood to the stand so we can use the speed square and use the circular saw to cut that piece of wood. And now we'll see it's the correct length, but that would be too tall of a height on the wall, so we're going to actually cut each of the walls that we have in half right there down the center. So there's one of the wall lengths, and then now we have the 3 boards that were 10.5 inches, and then we have the 3/4 of an inch on each side we had to add. So we're going to go ahead and take a look and see exactly what lengths we need for everything. So right here, you'll see that 3/4 inch wood on the right hand side is one section, and we have to account for that on the other side as well. So we know that the width was 10.5 inches. Can't really see the ruler that well, but that's okay. It's about 10.5. And then we have to account for that 3/4 inch wood. So we go to the 12 inch mark. And now we're supposed to strike a line with the speed square. And we're going to do the same exact thing once we get it all going. So we're just going to check that wood, hit it with one more tape measure real quick to make sure we got the right measurements. Measure twice, cut once. And now we're going to clamp the wood to the stand again. And what that's going to allow us to do is cut the wood without it slipping out. And we hit it with the circular saw and the speed square. And now we're back to the table saw. So like I said earlier, I like to keep the table saw unplugged while I'm working next to the blade. So I have to adjust the blade height here. You want to adjust the blade height about 1/2 tooth above the wood we're cutting. And that goes for any type of wood you're cutting. And now I'm just adjusting the fence to make sure we get a good cut. And so once we get it set where we want, we're going to go ahead and lock the fence in place. And then I'm going to go ahead and get the table saw going. So I've got my push stick, so I'm going to save distance away from the blade. And it looks like I was a little bit off from the center, and so what I went ahead and did on my own was I just go ahead and measure them to make sure that the pieces are both the same size for the walls. But here we're cutting the longer wall as well, and now we've got both walls for each side. So now we're going to go ahead and do a dry fit. We just put everything together before we glue it and use the brad nails to make sure everything fits. Alright, so now back to the respirator and the safety goggles. We're going to go ahead and use that metal brush wheel again. And we're going to do the same exact thing that we did for the board. We're going to do those for the walls as well. So we're going to run that metal brush wheel and the drill over it, go ahead and take out the meat from the grain, and we're going to do all that before we stain everything. So as you can see, when we blew off all the sawdust, there was quite a bit there from these small pieces. Now you can see what that metal brush wheel did to the wood by removing all the meat. Alright, and here you can see I actually had a little mistake. I hit the metal brush wheel on the wood, and so this is how we're going to fix it. we just grab the orbital sander and go over it real quick. One thing that's nice about rustic projects, they're very easy to fix because you can just run the sander over it and get it all going. And now you can see, barely noticeable. Alright, so now we're going to use the same exact process that we used for staining the rest of the project. We go ahead and put the stain in the bowl, and I decided to use the paintbrush again. And so the reason for that was because I wanted to get in the grain and in the areas where the brush metal wheel had gotten and removed some of the meat from the wood. And as you can see, we're not really having to be too careful about applying the stain. We just want to get it on there. It's going to be the same exact process that we did earlier, and once all the stain dries, we're going to sand it down, so it's not super crucial to get a perfect stain job on the walls or on the wood anywhere. And now we're getting the sanding going on the walls, and as you can see, it's nice when you do the walls because all the boards are a lot smaller, so you can actually do it in a big bunch, a big bundle. And so what you'll see is I went ahead and got all the boards at the same height and just sanded them down. And that quick run with the orbital sander over the wood is actually getting the job done really quickly. You'll notice I had one side blank on them because I had to get all three sides stained, and then once those dried and I got them sanded, I went ahead and flipped over the wood and got those pieces that are the raw wood stained up as well. Alright, so now for attaching the walls, we're going to do something very similar to what we did earlier. We've got that brad nailer that's going to help fasten everything to the wood glue on the walls and hold everything in place. So we put that bead of glue, and then we hold the wood in place and we hit it with that brad nailer. Again, I probably went a little overboard on the brad nails, but it gets the job done and we're learning. So now I've put that second bead of glue on the long wall, and then I hit it with the brad nailer again. So as you see, those brad nailers are going to fasten the wood on there while the glue dries. And now we've got that 3 board with the extra 3/4 inch on each side wall, and that was 12 inches total. So we go ahead and hit that with the brad nailer, get a couple of them in there. And now the last wall, we go ahead and hit that last bead of glue, and then we're going to fasten that to the wall, and then all the walls should be attached. Alright, and so now all 4 walls are attached, and this is what it looks like. So now that we've got all 4 walls attached, I went ahead and used some polyurethane to go ahead and give a final seal on the project. So as you can see, I chose a natural polyurethane because I didn't want to make the project any darker than it already is. And you saw the parts that are sanded down a little bit more around the words "Home Sweet Home." It actually gave it more of a natural wood look as opposed to a darker stain. So for my preference, when I was using the darker stain originally on the project, I wanted to leave it a little bit lighter, and so this natural polyurethane was perfect for me. And now as you can see, that polyurethane gave it a nice shine, but nothing too crazy. It's not reflective, but it did seal everything really well, and you can see that it gave it a nice look. And you can see right here that metal brush wheel really took out the meat in the grain, and that's the rustic look that we were going for. Most of us don't have a huge wood shop with expensive equipment, and many of us don't have every expensive tool at our disposal. So for those of you who are DIYers or woodwork hobbyists that just love to go out in the garage and work with their hands like me, here's a few key tips and takeaways that I've learned and that have helped me with some of my projects. Tip number 1, use what you know and take advantage of the tools at your disposal. Measure twice, cut once is a phrase that's said often in woodworking. However, we don't always need to use a tape measure when we're measuring wood for multiple repeat cuts. For the 3 pieces of wood that we used on the tray, they were all the same length. So we used the first board that we cut as a template for the repeat cuts. This doesn't have to be done with other saws. We can use a circular saw, but oftentimes a miter saw is much quicker when we're making the repeat cuts with a stop block. I personally don't have a miter saw, so I wanted to show the same result with the tools that I had available. Tip number 2, be safe. Always use the correct protective equipment. It's always good to use the right equipment to protect yourself when you're working with tools. Eye protection, ear protection, gloves if needed, are all great tools you can use to keep yourself safe. Another thing that I like to do that you saw in the video is keep my table saw unplugged until I'm ready to actually make cuts. The reason for that is because I have a job site table saw, which is smaller. I don't have a saw stop technology or anything fancy. So when you're working close to the blade, it's good to make sure that you don't cut yourself. Tip 3, mistakes happen. Know your options, how to fix them, and move on. So the first mistake I made was after using the light brown color to fill in the words "Home Sweet Home" and deciding I didn't like that color. Now this is a very easy mistake to fix, you just have to know how to do it. So when you look at it, the brown doesn't really contrast very well with the darker stain color. So what I did was use the black spray paint to spray in the words first, and then once those letters were filled in, then I used the black on the rest of the wood so I can make sure that it's all going to be uniform with the staining color once the finished product's done. So now, once I've got the black paint on the boards, I use the orbital sander, and you can see that the black pops much better on the wood. And so that's how we fix the first mistake. The second mistake I made was hitting the metal brush wheel on the bottom word that says "Home." This is a very simple mistake to fix, you just have to know how to do it. So all you have to do is use your orbital sander and take off a little bit more of the stain that's on the dried product, and then once it's done, you can barely even notice that there was a mistake in general. And that's one of the reasons I love the Rustic projects. Just remember that woodworking is a journey. There's always going to be mistakes, but you have to enjoy the process. If you enjoy doing woodworking, make sure that you're always learning. Learn from your mistakes and learn when you're trying new things. But the most important thing is just remember, always have fun. If you stayed through the entire video, thank you. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel to get notifications about upcoming future episodes. I hope you have a great day, and remember, let's always continue learning interesting things.